What starts as a stupid dare can end in absolute terror. Tonight, I'm sharing the story of Jake Martinez and Emma Collins, two college students who thought they were just proving their courage by exploring Ravenhill Cemetery at midnight. What they discovered among those weathered headstones wasn't just death, it was something far worse. Something that's been waiting in the shadows for decades, hungry for the living. This is their story, and I promise you, it will make you think twice about every cemetery you've ever walked past. Welcome back to my channel, where we dive into the most spine-chilling real horror stories that'll keep you awake at night. I'm your host, and before we begin, I need to warn you, tonight's story involves disturbing imagery and psychological terror that really happened. If you're easily scared, maybe save this one for daylight viewing. For everyone else who's ready to face the darkness, let's begin. It started with a TikTok trend called the Midnight Cemetery Challenge. The rules were simple: find the oldest cemetery in your town, enter at exactly midnight, document yourself walking to the oldest grave, and stay there for 10 minutes without leaving. Sounds harmless, right? That's exactly what Jake and Emma thought when their fraternity brothers dared them to complete the challenge. Jake was a sophomore at State University, studying engineering and known for never backing down from a dare. Emma was his girlfriend, a psychology major who was fascinated by death and the supernatural. Together, they were the perfect pair to tackle what seemed like a harmless prank. Ravenhill Cemetery was established in 1847, making it the oldest burial ground in Millfield County. The cemetery sprawls across 12 acres of rolling hills, with sections dating back to the Civil War era. But there's one particular area that locals avoid, the unmarked graves section in the northwest corner, where the town's outcasts and unknowns were buried without ceremony or remembrance. That's exactly where Jake and Emma decided to go. They arrived at Ravenhill at 11:45 p.m. on a moonless October night. Jake brought his phone for recording, while Emma carried a flashlight and her camera. The cemetery gates were locked, but like most old cemeteries, the stone walls had crumbled in places, making entry easy for determined trespassers. "Okay, so we're actually doing this," Jake whispers to his camera as they climb through a gap in the wall. Emma found the oldest grave online. It belongs to someone called the Nameless Woman from 1851. Apparently, she was buried without identification after being found dead under mysterious circumstances. Emma's research had uncovered the disturbing history of this particular grave. According to old newspaper clippings, the woman had been discovered in the woods outside town, but her body showed no signs of violence or disease. She simply died. The townspeople were so disturbed by the circumstances that they refused to give her a proper burial in the consecrated ground, instead placing her in the unnamed section. As they walked deeper into the cemetery, their flashlights casting dancing shadows across weathered headstones, Emma started feeling uneasy. "Jake, something's wrong here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too quiet. Even for a cemetery." She was right. There were no cricket sounds, no rustling leaves, no distant traffic noise. The silence was absolute, as if the cemetery existed in a bubble separate from the living world. At exactly midnight, they found her, the Nameless Woman's grave. Unlike the other headstones, this one was just a simple stone marker with no name, no dates, just a crude carving of a wilted flower. But what made Jake and Emma's blood run cold wasn't the grave itself, it was what surrounded it. The ground around the headstone was completely bare. No grass, no weeds, nothing grew within a perfect circle about 6 feet in diameter. Even stranger, the earth looked fresh, as if it had been recently disturbed, despite the grave being over 170 years old. "This is seriously creepy," Emma said, her camera shaking as she recorded. "The soil looks like it was just turned over, but that's impossible." Jake, trying to maintain his brave facade, laughed nervously. "Come on, Em. It's probably just the groundskeepers. We need to stay here for 10 minutes to complete the challenge." That's when they heard it, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone. Both of them froze, their flashlights scanning the darkness around them. The sound came again, definitely closer this time. "Jake, we need to leave." "Now," Emma said, her voice rising with panic. But Jake was determined to complete the challenge. He'd already posted on social media about attempting it, and backing out now would mean weeks of ridicule from his friends. "It's just an animal or something. We're staying." What happened next defies logical explanation. According to both Jake and Emma's testimonies, the temperature around the graves suddenly dropped at least 20 degrees. Their breath became visible in the air, and frost began forming on the headstone despite the mild October weather. Then they saw her. A woman emerged from behind the headstone, but she wasn't walking, she was rising from the ground itself, as if the earth was giving birth to her. She was tall and thin, wearing a tattered white dress that might have once been beautiful. Her long, dark hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her skin had a sickly gray pallor that seemed to glow in the moonlight. But it was her eyes that truly terrified them. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye socket, as if someone had carved out hollow spaces in her skull. "She's not dead," Emma whispered, her camera still recording despite her terror. "She's not alive either. She's something else entirely." The woman, if that's what she was, began moving toward them with jerky, unnatural movements, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. She opened her mouth to speak, and instead of words, a sound emerged that was part whisper, part scream, and entirely inhuman. Jake later described it as the sound of loneliness itself, like every person who ever died alone crying out at once. As the creature drew closer, Emma's psychology background kicked in, and she began to understand what they were facing. This wasn't just a ghost or a zombie, this was something far more tragic and dangerous. "She's not evil," Emma said, her voice steady despite her fear. "She's hungry. Not for flesh, for identity. She was buried without a name, without anyone to remember her. She's been feeding off the identities of people who come here, trying to become real again." The creature stopped just feet away from them, tilting her head as if listening to Emma's words. For a moment, her terrible black eyes seemed almost human, filled with a desperate sadness that was heartbreaking to witness. But then Jake made a fatal mistake. In his panic, he turned to run, and the creature's attention snapped to him like a predator spotting prey. She lunged forward with inhuman speed, reaching out with fingers that were too long and ended in ragged, dirty nails. Jake screamed as the creature's hand touched his shoulder. Later, he would describe the sensation as having my soul partially sucked out through my skin. He felt his memories, his personality, his very sense of self being drained away. Emma, thinking quickly, began shouting the names of everyone buried in the cemetery that she could remember from her research. Mary Patterson, Thomas Blackwood, Sarah Chen, Robert Williams. The creature paused, confused by the flood of names and identities. That moment of confusion was all they needed. Jake and Emma ran through the cemetery faster than they'd ever moved in their lives, leaping over headstones and crashing through overgrown sections. Behind them, they could hear the creature's inhuman wailing growing fainter with distance. They didn't stop running until they reached Jake's car, and even then, they sat in terrified silence for several minutes before Jake could steady his hands enough to start the engine. But their ordeal wasn't over. On the drive home, Jake began experiencing disturbing symptoms. He couldn't remember his middle name, had trouble recalling his childhood address, and kept referring to himself in the third person. Emma realized with growing horror that the creature had successfully stolen part of his identity. Over the following weeks, Jake's condition worsened. He would sometimes forget his own name, introduce himself as the Nameless One, and had vivid nightmares about being buried alive in an unmarked grave. Emma tried to help him, but she was dealing with her own trauma. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those hollow black eye sockets staring at her. 3 months later, Jake dropped out of college and moved back home with his parents. He still struggles with identity issues and has been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, though his psychiatrist can't explain the sudden onset. Emma changed her major from psychology to art therapy, dedicating her life to helping people process trauma. The most disturbing part of their story? Emma's camera captured everything. The footage exists, and it shows exactly what I've described, a creature that shouldn't exist, feeding on the very essence of what makes us human. Ravenhill Cemetery has since been permanently closed to the public after several other incidents involving the Midnight Cemetery Challenge. Local authorities won't discuss the details, but they've placed security cameras and motion sensors throughout the grounds. But here's what really keeps me awake at night: Emma's research revealed that the nameless woman isn't unique. There are unmarked graves in cemeteries across the country, places where people were buried without identity or ceremony. And according to paranormal investigators, similar encounters have been reported at dozens of these locations. The dead don't rest when they're forgotten. They hunger. They wait. And they feed on the living who are foolish enough to disturb their eternal loneliness. So the next time you see a social media challenge involving cemeteries or abandoned places, remember Jake and Emma's story. Some dares aren't worth the risk, and some places are better left undisturbed. What do you think? Was this a supernatural encounter, or could there be a psychological explanation for what happened to Jake and Emma? Let me know in the comments below, but maybe do it with the lights on. Don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying true stories, and remember, the dead don't always stay dead, especially when they've been forgotten by the living. Sleep tight.